Hey gang, it is Wednesday, August 16th, and this is Brooklyn Pony Part 10. I know you've been patiently waiting, and I'm glad for that, and I'm sorry it's taken so long to get this thing put together, but I wanted to take my time and make sure everything was right. If you followed along, you know that in the previous series I showed the buildup of everything from the floor pan to the rear section of the car, including wheelhouses, quarters, all those various parts and pieces, and also installation of the outer rocker panels. As you know, I've salvaged some parts from the original car, and a lot of it was the inner seat structure, the rain gutter, the inner structure for the mount points of these panels here, and of course the filler panel in relation to the trunk lid. Now I did also salvage the A-pillars and the windshield frame out of the original car, and in that process I found that the dash was no good. It had rust holes through it, so it wasn't savable, and also the kick panels were no good, so I salvaged those along with the dash out of the donor coupe, and that is what we have here. There's the dash, and I'll have to do a radio repair on that just because the minor cut up of the opening, so I have the patch panel for that. And I did salvage these kick panels and transfer those into the original A-pillar structure. Also did some repair work up here. Some of the metal was rusted away, and so all this will get treated and painted and everything, but just showing you some of the repair work that took place. Also over here, this section and this piece right here. Now these kick panels, they are a little more complicated than just pulling them apart, because this upper part of the windshield frame actually overlaps this part of the panel. So in the process, what I did is I cut a line up here and saved what was underneath this, and then also, if you can see on this other side, I cut down here and removed the original section of the panel, and then I pre-fit this piece, which I salvaged again from the other car, into this location, and then welded it at those locations as well. So that's taken some time. It was a little more effort than I expected, but I wanted to use these original panels because they're in pretty good shape, and it just means more to me to have it as original. And here you can see it still has the stampings in it from the factory. Alright, with that in mind, what I did when I removed the A-pillars, and when I removed them from the coupe, I did some measuring. The difficulty between doing it between the convertible and the coupe was the convertible had issues. The original car was collapsing on itself, so I couldn't get a good measurement. And what I did when I sectioned out the A-pillar pieces, and here they are right there, I did some measuring. And I'm going to do some more measuring as I go along, and also test fitting. But basically I used the corner reference of this upper corner here, and I measured down to the mount point, let's say, of the B-pillar, or also the quarter panel. And I got a measurement, and you can see there's my drawing, sticker drawing, and that measurement was 50 5/8 inches from that corner down to that base. On the opposite side of that, I measured up in the corner of the quarter, which is up here, this location, and I measured down to that corner, which is here, of this one, and that measurement was 54 inches. Now, what's significant, I say significant, maybe it's not, the measurements were different from side to side, only a little bit. That's 7/8 on this side, that's 50 9/16. So, not that that's that critical, because these cars didn't have these tight tolerances like a modern car, where they're all measured on with lasers and jigs and everything else. So there are some allowance there. But what I'm going to do, aside from measuring out those dimensions like I just showed you, I will also mount one of the doors, or the doors, on the side. I'll put the hinges on and test fit the the door itself to make sure that it lines up and that there's a proper gap, or at least enough room that I can adjust fore and aft. As you know, there's a lot of play in these mounts for the hinges. That's why they have these big holes. But it's critical to me that I have that in the right location, and I have these dimensions, fore and aft, the right dimension. And I will also, I have a friend who has a coupe and also access to another convertible. I will do some more measuring on their cars as well, just to verify. But I'm pretty comfortable with where this is. Also, the kick panel, as you can see, runs on the outside of the rocker. And here you can see the old drill holes. The drill holes from where I had separated everything from the welds. Now, beyond that, once everything is in place, there's a few things that have to happen in a certain sequence. And if any of you were in the military, there's an expression I use, which we used in the military, particularly during testing, that sequence is scored. And what they meant by that was you can do things in a variety of ways, but per the military, they wanted it done in a certain sequence. That's just the way the manual reads, and that's the way the instructions read. So I'm going to show you something here that I think is interesting. I've got to install the front frame rails, and I also have to install the torque boxes, and of course the firewall. Now you'll notice the firewall is not sitting flush, and it can't sit flush. The reason for that is this is a universal fit kind of firewall. Even though this is a Dynacorn part, they're not made specific. This is made to fit either a coupe or a convertible, and so you can see the width. Hopefully you can see that. I know the lighting's not helping, but this is, you know, 2.5 inches wider because of this inner rocker of the convertible is wider than the coupe. So the panel would fit into a coupe pretty easily. You can also see the gap on the side. And I did a video on this before. Let me show you on that side. Again, there's the overlap. I did a video on this on the light blue Mustang. What I had to do was build angle supports to support the edge of this firewall. They don't give you enough material because there's too much variance in these cars. I could show you, different places where the measurements are going to be different. But to make it simple, they make it basically fit a coupe, and then you modify it to fit the convertible. So I'm going to have to cut that and come up to a certain distance and across and let it slide down inside the inner rocker. So that'll take care of that. Also, because of the sequence of this car, this lower section of the firewall will go underneath the floor pan. And you can see there's a gap right there. They leave that so you can get the floor pan underneath it. Now I will also pre-drill some holes on top so that I can weld those, and then I will drill holes through the top of this pan so that when the firewall is underneath it, I can weld those solid. Okay, that's simple enough, and that can be done. That really is going to have to be done prior to anything else going in. So I'm going to do fitment on that, and then due to the sequence, the torque boxes will have to go, the frame rails will have to go next. The reason for that is the torque boxes have this section underneath here, which is going to weld to the bottom of this floor support. For that to make sense and make it work proper, I need to have the rails in first, because I need to weld through the sides of this floor support. So this direction, and obviously this direction, but I also need to weld from the bottom. So I'll get the floor supports in place, and then I'll put the rocker or the torque boxes in place. So I'm just trying to point these out to you so that you can't just jump ahead. If you put the torque box in first, you're not going to be able to weld in the floor support properly. The frame rail properly. And you can't put the frame rails in before the firewall, because you can't get the firewall in with the structure of the back structure here of the frame rail. Or at least you can't get it in properly. You can put it on top which I've done because I was limited on the light blue Mustang years ago. I could not modify it to fit, you know, underneath, slip it underneath the floor pan because the frame rail was in place. Hope that makes sense. I'm just trying to clarify so that, you know, when you're on these projects, take your time and have a look at what you're working on and just identify, you know, these situations. Now beyond that, I also have the cowl, upper and lower half, and I've already test fitted them to the repair work that I've done on the windshield frame, and everything fits very nice, so I'm happy with that. Beyond that, hope that wasn't too lengthy, but this is the truth. I've got to be able to share this information with you, and it just takes time to relate all that. So anyway, my next step is going to be doing a final fitment on the A-pillar windshield frame structure, getting those welded in, and then working towards getting the firewall to fit properly. Alright, so I feel like I'm making some progress. I've been doing measuring and cross measuring and fitting, and I've had the door on here, and I did go measure those other cars, and I'm confident with the measurements that I have, and I've measured from a variety of places. Using, let's say, this reference here for the fender mount, and I know that can be manipulated and bent slightly, but the base of it is pretty close. I've measured there to, say, back in this area, and even, you know, from here up to the inside of this corner. I've measured from that flange that is part of the Donicorn structure of the floor pan, and they all have that again to up here in this corner. I've done a bunch of things, and I'm really happy with the results. I even put the top on to verify that it fit the windshield frame, and so I'm really happy with all that. But I'm not ready to weld just yet. I'm still doing fitment, and I will continue to do fitment until I'm 100% satisfied. But I wanted to show you this. I'm going to work on fitting the firewall, and hopefully the light doesn't affect us too much here. As I said before, this firewall is wider than the convertible floor pan, so it's going to have to be trimmed. And I just did some simple things here. I took, in this case, just took a block of wood, set it up underneath here, and just use it as a guide to draw a straight line. Now this line from this lower flat section over is going to go away, because that actually goes underneath the pan, and it'll cause a problem if I try to fit around the rocker. I hope that makes sense. I could probably do it if I came in from the front, but then I have other flanges to deal with. It may work. I may leave it for the moment, but I'm just trying to point out some things. I drew basically a straight line up, and I took a framing square and I set it inside of the in between the firewall and, let's say, the kick panel. But I had done also done a drop measurement from the top of the rocker down to the floor pan, and if I remember correctly, well, it was 3 7/8. That was the drop from here to here. So I just used my framing square, pushed it in until I got a measurement of 3 7/8, and drew a line. So that gave me the height, because you're not going to be at a square. This being that the firewall is at an angle, you have to compensate for that. So obviously this length, if you cut it, you know, by this measurement, it's like, you know, 6 inches or whatever. So anyway, I drew that line, and then I took my 1/2-inch scale, laid it inside, and drew a second line. And the reason for that is I'm going to create a flange. So I will have a cut line here, here, and here, and then I will cut here and here, and I will make the decision. I will probably leave most of this here until I cut this off, this whole section over here. And then either way I have to do something here, because I can't, it'll get in the way. Anyway, I can take this section and bend it up, take this piece and bend it up, and this piece and bend it slightly. And that'll give me kind of a pocket that'll sit on top of the inner rocker. I hope that makes sense. It makes sense to me. So I'm going to replicate that on the other side and cut that out, and then I can lower the firewall into place and verify fitment underneath the floor pan, and that's going to help with some of this fitment. Now the other part of that is, once I get that down in place, and like I said, they make these firewalls kind of a universal fit. You can see that gap, and that's normal. That's how they're made. They do it on purpose. But once I get that down in, then I can work on creating a new flange out of some leftover material that'll go underneath and then come up and attach to the kick panel and the rest of the rocker. I hope that makes sense, but that's where I'm at right now. Again, I'm still doing, fitment and measuring and test fitting, and I'll see how that turns out. Alright, as I'm doing this, I wanted to point out another thing. I made a cardboard template of the pattern of the inner rocker. And what I did is I took a piece of cardboard and I laid it at the same angle as the firewall so that I would have the length to compensate for the angle. Because I wouldn't be doing it straight up and down, it would be at an angle. So that's what this was for. And basically I traced it like that so that I had that pattern, and that's how I got my outside pattern transferred. I don't think I mentioned that before, but at this point I've trimmed out this inner piece, and just for simplicity's sake I'm going to use what they call duckbill pliers. These are used a lot in the aircraft industry, and all I'm going to do, hope you can see this okay. The plan is I want to create flanges, so I'm just gently going to start rolling this up following that line. Once I get it to a certain point, then I'll use my hammer and dolly and get the angle that I really want. And that's going to give me a nice flange. Weld that together. And then I'll probably add some holes, or I may weld it on the edge. I haven't decided yet, but either way, this gives me a flange. And I've already done the driver's side, same way. And I'm going to test fit it and see if this will go underneath this little extra piece. If it will, I'll leave it because that gives me something else to weld to, and it creates or eliminates a gap. Well, I think I'm pretty close. I was able to get it to slide under the rocker, like I said, and it slid underneath the whole front edge of the floor pan. Fits pretty close. And again, it gives me a nice flange to weld. And of course, I'll adjust those as necessary to make a good tight fit. This side, driver's side, is really close. And what I'll do is I'll also set the cowl up here to make sure everything lines up and fits. Now on the passenger side, my measurement may have been just a little bit off. I'll have to adjust that so I can bring it down just a little bit because it's sitting a little bit high on this side. But I think I'm pretty close. I like that. That's a nice easy way to make it fit underneath the floor pan. So let me do some adjusting on that and verify fitment. Alright, I think I'm done for tonight. I did some more trimming and adjusted the fitment on the bottom there. Very happy with that. I also test fitted the cowl, and it's fitting very nice, so I'm happy with that. Everything's dropping in place nice. There's a little bit of a lip on this side panel, and this dropped in behind it like it should, and same thing over here. Now I did set the frame rails in place, and they butted up perfect to the firewall, but we'll get to that later. At this point I'm very close to welding, and I want to do just a few more fitment things to make sure everything's right before I fully commit. You know, it's always important. You can't get in a hurry. If you're going to make it right, take your time. Measure, check, and measure and check again until you're truly satisfied, and then weld away. Alright, so I've measured, I've remeasured, I've cross-measured, I've done every kind of measurement I can think of. I had the original door mounted, and it fit well. I had the aftermarket door mounted, it fit well. And so I think I'm satisfied, and I'm going to go ahead and weld the A-pillars in place. There's some other things I need to talk about, and part of that is these torque boxes, which I'm confident now that I'm going to have to take those apart in order to get them in correctly. It's just too much overlap with the frame rails to get everything in there as an assembly. So that's where my plan is. I will take the torque box apart and work it in piece by piece. Otherwise, I will say this: I did have the firewall fitted around the inner rocker panel, but that's not going to work as well as I had hoped because of these flanges here on the upper half of the torque box. So again, I'll have to get this in and then adjust the fitment of the firewall or whatever, or make it so that the firewall will have space for these pieces to get in there so I can weld them in. I hope that makes sense. You'll see whenever I get to that point. Basically, I have this too snug where that fits right there, and I'll have to open those up a little bit to allow room for the torque box. So it gets a little complicated. There's a lot of things that have to line up just right, and that's why I'm taking my time and making sure I'm satisfied with everything. So at this point, I'm pretty happy with it, and I'm gonna start welding those pieces in. Alright, so as you can see, I hope you can see, I have welded in the A-pillars and the forward lower section of the kick panel, and taking everything else out of the way. Now, I was talking before about the torque boxes and how they were going to be very difficult, or they would be very difficult to try to put in as an assembly. So what I've done is I drilled out the welds on the passenger side, and that was easy enough. They separated nicely. Then, since I had the firewall removed, and you'll note, of course, on the convertible it has this inner rocker, so that's a bit different. And the shape of this is supposed to relate to that inner rocker. So if I slide this in and rotate it, it doesn't line up. And the reason for that is it's hitting on this flange for the floor support. So I'm going to have to trim this corner off right there, and then I'll be able to rotate this up and get it more level or plane in plane with the where the firewall will be. So that's the plan right now. Again, I'll just trim off that corner, or somewhat, to make it match the shape of the floor support. And hopefully you can see that I cut off, basically I think it was just excess material for the most part. And so now I can rotate it up, and it lines up much better. It'll clear that corner. I may trim just a little bit more off, just a little, just to make sure there's enough room. And you can see there's a gap where that flange rolls back to the floor support. I'm going to reshape that as well. It's a bit round in this corner down here, and so I'm just going to put it on my steel table and use my hammer, my body hammer, and kind of push this flange that direction and try to clean up this corner just a little bit more. Alright, I've said before, you know, everything is like a big puzzle, and I want to point out that I've stressed before about the shortness of this firewall on the edge, and I think what their plan was with this was they wanted it to fit any Mustang that would have had a torque box, ideally. I mean, I've talked about it having that gap, you'd have to make your own flange. I did this on the 65 Mustang a few years ago, and I had to make flanges for this, but it did not have torque boxes. Well, if you look at this torque box, of course, it's got a flange up here. And I want to show you this. I've already made some adjustments to those flanges for the firewall. And I want to take this piece and fit that in. And then I can clamp the firewall where it needs to be. That fits real nice. And same way with the, let's say, the upper panel of the torque box. So I can clamp that in. And I'll just show you, I think this is looking really good. Like I said, everything's kind of a puzzle, and you got to get the pieces in the right sequence. So that fits really nice. It does have a little bit of an issue down here at the bottom. I'll work on that a little more to get that to fit the floor support, but otherwise it fits really well to the inner rocker panel and also to the firewall. And I should note that the firewall fits nice and flush to the kick panels on both sides, like it should. And come inside, and you can see that it lines up real nice on the inside, and that creates the flange to support the firewall. So everything is lining up really well. And at this point, you can probably, well, you can see I've marked holes where I'm going to drill into the floor pan, and also to the where it overlaps the upper part of the torque box. I'll drill those holes and a variety of holes around the perimeter so that I can weld all that in. Now again, everything has to go in a sequence. So to me, once the main thing is to get the firewall set with the upper panels of the torque boxes. So what I'll do is I will treat the back side of this panel, and I'll probably even apply some paint to the bottom of the firewall so that they interact, you know, and they stay hopefully stop any potential rust. But I want to take care of those surfaces, and I haven't taken apart the other torque box yet, so I got to take that apart and make it fit as well on the driver's side. So once all that is in place, then I can weld in the firewall and the upper half of the torque boxes all at the same time, and that'll take care of all of that in one shot. Then what I'll do is fit the frame rail, I believe is how my sequence is going to go. And I want to show you this. I've had people mention, how are you going to line up the frame rail and different things. Well, ideally, the way I look at it is, of course, I'll do measuring, you know, to make sure everything is in plane as best as I can. But the angle, or the bottom of the frame rail, is going to sit into the pocket of the floor support. So if you can feel it flatten out when you wiggle it up and down, you get to a flat point, and then I'm going to push it back. I'm going to show you that, if you can see it from my camera angles good, how well that frame rail fits the firewall. It's completely flush. And so as you can see, I've also traced out the pattern for the the frame rail. So I will drill holes from the bottom up through the firewall, so that whenever I get everything in place, I can weld the through the firewall to the frame rail. Beyond that, I will drill holes in the side of the floor support on both sides and the bottom, again to attach the frame rail. Once the frame rail is in place, then I can put in the lower half of the torque box and weld it back in. So again, it's a great opportunity to treat all this metal, put some paint on there, and take care of it now, because once it's in, it's in. There's nothing else you can do. Beyond that, I'm just going to start finishing up the driver's side and try to get this firewall in place. Alright, so now I have the passenger side fitted, and it fits pretty nice as well. I may do some fine tuning again down at the bottom, but that may come later. For now, I'm more concerned with how it fits the firewall, and also it fits the rocker panel. So again, that's pretty nice. I did trace a line around the edge of the upper half of the torque box, and with that I'll be able to drill some holes through the firewall, so that when I put everything in place, I can weld the upper half of the torque box to the firewall, and that will help secure everything as well. So at this point, I'll pull everything back apart. I did drill holes across the perimeter of the floor pan and over here in the corner for the flanges. So still a few holes to drill. And you can see there's my trace line there on that one. But still a few holes to drill, and then I can do some more, a little more paint prep on the upper half of these panels here, and start putting things together permanently. Alright, so like I said, I put some paint on the bottom side of the firewall, and I also painted the back side, or the upper half, of the torque boxes. So I'm going to get those in place, and I believe I'm ready to start welding. I did want to mention one more thing. On the upper half of the torque boxes, you can maybe see there, I did drill some holes so that I can weld them to the inner rocker panel directly, and I will probably also do some edge weld, but there's also, let's see, there's a hole on top right there as well. So just a reference. I did the same thing on the passenger side. This one's not set in place completely because I'm getting ready to weld the driver's side first, and it's fitting pretty well. Of course, it'll fit better once I get the vice grips moved around and have everything in place. Fits really nice up here at the top of the firewall to the bottom half of the cowl. Same way here. So I'm going to get some welding done. Alright, the firewall is welded to the side panels. The upper half of the torque boxes is welded to the firewall. And the firewall is welded to the floor pan. Everything went in pretty smooth. Really happy with it. You can see my welds on the top half, to the top half of the torque box, and then of course all the welds where everything joins together at the rocker. So still a lot more to do, but I'm going to call this the end of part 10. This will probably be another long video, and I know there's a lot of ground covered, and there's still a lot more to cover, and I know y'all like the long videos, but I've reached a stopping point, partly because I ran out of gas in my MIG welder, so I need to go get a new bottle, and that's probably a lot of information to cover at this point for this length of this video, and still a lot of editing to do to make all this happen. So the longer the videos, the longer the amount of time I have to edit, and I want to make sure that I'm not, you know, spending 6 hours at the computer trying to edit a video. So this is the end of part 10, and in the next video I will work on getting the dash in and installing the lower and upper halves of the cowl, and I'll also work on getting the frame rails in place along with the lower half of the torque boxes, and those right there. So anyway, hope that gave you some answers to some questions and helps you along the way in your project. I think that's it. So once again, thanks for watching.